Now, The Contenders, our series on key political figures who ran for president and lost, but who nevertheless changed political history. Next, we feature former House Speaker Henry Clay of Kentucky, known as the Great Compromiser. The program was recorded at Clay's Ashland estate in Lexington, Kentucky, and is about 90 minutes. This 14-week series is airing at 8 p.m. Eastern, August 1 through August 14th, here on American History TV on C-SPAN 3.
This is a portrait of Kentucky's Henry Clay, known to us in our history books as the Great Compromiser. During his 49-year political career, Clay served as Secretary of State, Speaker of the House, and as a U.S. Senator. And he was a contender, making 5 presidential bids, including the election of 1824, 1832 against Andrew Jackson, and 1844 when he ran against James K. Polk. Tonight we are on location at Ashland, Henry Clay's home in Lexington, Kentucky, and for the next 90 minutes we will explore the life and legacy of this man. Unsuccessful in his long quest for the White House, yet having an outsized influence on American history. And we are in Henry Clay's parlor right now. Let me introduce you to Jim Clotter, 25 years now as Kentucky's state historian. Jim, thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here.
Well, why Henry Clay, why is he relevant to Americans living in our time?
I think on a couple of accounts. First of all, his famous comment, "I would rather be right than be president," I think still speaks to us. It's a clarion call to people all across whatever we're doing, whether we're in politics or something else, is to do the right thing. He also said, that in a sense, that politicians need to remember the country and sacrifice for the country. And I think that is still something that we need to remember as well. And of course, the man known as a Great Compromiser, a man that forged these compromises that not only kept the nation together, but were constructive. And those kind of things, I think, are the kinds of things we need to remember about Henry Clay, as well as all the things that he did in his life. They again, are a clarion call over and over to us, to say to us again and again that we can do a lot of things if we just do and try, as a self-made man did, Henry Clay.
Well, we're going to try to fit 49 years of rich political history during a very complex and interesting time of American history into our program tonight. But let's start with some basics about his biography. Where and when was he born, and then how did he get to Kentucky?
He was born in 1777, and the 7th child, and his father died very young. Clay's mother remarried to a younger man, but Clay liked to think of himself as this self-made man, as this man, the mill boy of the slashes, carrying the corn to the mill and working himself to the bone and coming up from the ranks from a very poor family. But in essence, he came from a very well-to-do family. They had slaves. They weren't that bad off, but it was part of the persona that Clay then presented as himself. From there, he went through his family basically came to Kentucky, leaving him back in Virginia when he was 14 years old to be on his own. And from there, then he finally joined them back in Kentucky when he was 20 years old as a young lawyer, married well. The easiest way to get rich is to marry well, and he did that. And this estate that we're in today is an example of what he did with his start and with his promise, and he made himself into somebody that all Americans knew.
Whom did he marry?
Lucretia Clay, Lucretia Hart Clay. And Lucretia was from the Hart family, which is an early family in Kentucky. Marriage into that family also gave him entry into a lot of the political circles that would have probably been denied him. She brought with that marriage some money, and they basically had the connections because her family was related to a lot of people, and he used those connections to move forward. But he also, once he got his foot in the door, that he could open the door himself through his own skills and his own abilities.
If Henry Clay were, through time travel, standing here today, what will we see? What did he look like? What did he sound like?
Oh, Clay would have, I don't think anybody would sit down with Henry Clay and not leave without liking Henry Clay. He was a man, not a handsome man. Everybody says he was ugly. In fact, they always comment about his large mouth. They said his mouth was so large that he couldn't even spit properly. And he was a man who liked the ladies, as they said. And somebody at the time said he could kiss them out of one side of his mouth while he was resting the other side of his mouth. So that was a kind of, but as soon as he opened that mouth, a great oratory came out. And he could charm you. He had that charisma that if there was a person of the opposite party that one time came to Henry Clay's home and to a party that Clay was doing, and there was a room filled with people, a room bigger than this. And the man said to this man from the other party, he said, "Wouldn't you like to meet the famous Mr. Clay?" And this Democrat said about the Whig Clay, "No, sir, no, sir. I did not choose to subject myself to the spell of his fascination." Because he knew that Henry Clay would suck him into his orbit if he just met Henry Clay, because he had that personality, that charisma, that charm, that anybody who would meet him would like Henry Clay one-on-one.
Do you know, was this just a genetic gift, or did he school himself to be an orator? Did he have a mentor? Where did he get this from?
He worked at it. He'd heard Patrick Henry speak back in Virginia, and he was just amazed by the force of Henry's oratory, and he wanted to be like that, and he worked at it. He talks about giving speeches to the cows in the field as practice. And then he came to Kentucky as a lawyer. You almost had to convince your juries through this force of your words, not necessarily through the law itself, in frontier state like that. And so he developed it, but it was almost a self-made orator too, because over time it was something he could turn on a minute and speak on the issues. It was impossible to challenge Clay in a debate, because he would get up on the spur of the moment and come up with all the facts and all the figures and win the argument. John C. Calhoun once prepared a talk for 2 weeks, and Clay got up and demolished it within instantly. And that's the kind of man that Clay was. And had he been able to appear on television, he could have really been a very effective politician. But of course, at that time, you didn't campaign for president. There was no radio. So you had to, that force of the oratory was lessened, and only in Congress would you really have the full force of that.
When we've been talking with historians and people here at Ashland about him, they keep telling us that he was the equivalent of a rock star in his time. Everybody in the country knew him. Now, in a country without mass communication, how was it possible for everybody to know who Henry Clay was?
Politics was the sports of that time. It was the game that everybody followed. There were no organized sports as we know it, things like that. There wasn't any musical things except in the church and things like that. So the politics and the oratory, everybody wanted to follow that just as closely as they could. And the oratory, the speeches of a Clay or a Webster, young boys in school and girls would write these down and would practice them over and over again, because they wanted to be like a Henry Clay. But he was like a rock star. I mean, he would be followed by adoring people. He would go into towns, and there's an example of 100,000 people turning out to hear him speak at one time in Dayton, Ohio. He had children named for him. He had steamboats named for him. He had everything named for him. He was a man that people wanted to see, just to savor the excellence of Henry Clay.
Well, politicians still talk about Henry Clay today. Let's listen in to Kentucky's senior senator, Mitch McConnell, referencing Henry Clay.
Henry Clay was the greatest statesman that my home state ever produced. He served the people as Speaker of the Kentucky House of Representatives, Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Secretary of State under President John Quincy Adams, and of course as one of the greatest senators to ever walk through the Capitol. He was also honored to receive his party's nomination for president 3 times, in 1824, 1832, and 1844. The essence of legislating in the Senate, as 100 viewpoints are brought together to create one law, is compromise. Henry Clay became known as the Great Compromiser by forging the compromise that would keep his precious Union together. Clay did not compromise in the sense of forsaking his principles. Rather, his skill was to bring together disparate ideas and forge consensus among his colleagues. That's a skill we could certainly use more of now.
During the great debates we just went through this summer over the debt ceiling and the budget, there was so much talk about compromise in Washington and whether or not it's a lost art. Talk to us a little bit in that context about Henry Clay as the great compromiser and what sort of skills he brought to bear there.
Clay, if he wanted something to happen, would work very hard to make it happen. He would sit down with people, he would find out what they wanted, he would go to the other side, see what they would want. He tried to find some common ground, somewhere in the middle. It cost him though, because As they say about compromisers, there's a sign, I think, in the Attorney General's office in the 1960s that said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall catch hell from both sides." And in a sense, Clay caught that problem from both sides, and it hurt him politically. But at the same time, he felt he had to do this because the nation required it. The nation had been founded on a compromise. The Constitution is a compromise. And if the nation did not compromise on these issues, it would tear itself apart. And so Clay had an urgency behind everything he did. And he actually compromised some of his principles for the sake of the Union. In the 1833 Compromise, he gave up his beloved tariff issues for the sake of keeping the Union together and not having secessionists break off and fight a war against Andrew Jackson. But at the same time, the greater thing that he would not compromise on was the Union. He said at one time, "If anybody wants to know the key to my heart, the Union is the key to my heart." That was the thing he would never compromise on.
When we're talking about echoes of today, the American system, which is something he promoted, had major components which include tariffs, you just referenced, spending the money from the tariffs on building American infrastructure, and then also the big debate over a national bank. We're still discussing how effective these things are in today's economy. What was the country like then, and what was the level of debate over issues such as the tariff and the national bank?
Very philosophical issues that were issues from the very start of the nation. They were still issues when Henry Clay came around. They're still issues today. Do we have a strong central government, or do we have strong state governments? These are the issues that Clay spoke on. He thought a national government should do things for the nation, and that the states could not accomplish these. And he spoke out on that, and people spoke against him for that, and it hurt him in a lot of ways politically as well. But he felt like these roads, these canals, these internal improvements were necessary to tie the country together. Otherwise it would fragment into east, west, north, south. And his comment at one time was, "I know no north, no south, no east, no west." To him it was one country, indivisible, and these would be ways to keep it together. A tariff would protect American industry, he thought, and allow it to grow. He didn't say a tariff had to be there all the time, but a tariff would help American industry grow to be strong so it could compete against Britain and against other groups like that. And then a Bank of the United States. At the time the United States was being formed, hard money was the only legal currency. The government didn't print paper money. Some banks did, but they could be weak banks and the money would go away. So Clay wanted to make a central bank that we wouldn't have until the Federal Reserve System was set up in the 20th century. And that Bank of the United States became very controversial as well and hurt him politically when he supported that. But he thought all of this was necessary for the good of the nation.
Well, Henry Clay sounds like a pretty good guy, but you said he had a lot of enemies. He also was known to have some vices. What were his vices?
And you talked about the age that this was in. Those vices became more prominent the longer he lived as far as the political scene went, because in his youth he was known as a person who liked to gamble. He said it was a very good political tool. He could sit down at Ghent when he was making the peace treaty with the British in the War of 1812 and sit across from the British and play poker with them and see how much they would like to bluff or how much they would call his bluff. So he saw it as a tool some ways. He loved to gamble, as a lot of people did. He would lose huge amounts of money one night, win them back the next night. His wife, Lucretia, when somebody chatted her about her husband being a man who liked to gamble so much, she said, "Oh, I don't know, he usually wins." And so he did win a lot. But he liked the spirit of the gamble. But as he got older, he didn't do that as much. He liked to drink, as most Americans did at that time, in a time when water was not very safe to drink. He preferred wine, but he never really got drunk, but he enjoyed it. But all those things were used against him by the moral side of America that thought that Clay was a womanizer, a blasphemer, a duelist, and a drinker. And so those things would be used against him over and over again. Really, at different times in his life, there was something to some of those, but it was much exaggerated. It became part of the stereotype of Henry Clay.
Clay died in 1852, so the 50-year career we're talking about spans the first half of the 19th century in America. A great year, many years full of the formation of the nation, and also sectionalism and the fights over slavery. We have so much to talk about, and during this program we will be opening up our phone lines for your participation. I'm going to give you the phone numbers now if you want to get in the queue. It'll be a little bit of time before we get to calls, but if you're interested and anxious to do so, you can get in line. 202-737-0001 if you live in the Eastern or Central time zones. If you live in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, the number is 202-737-0002, and we welcome your questions, your comments, your own input into this period of American history. It makes the discussion much richer. Well, we want to also listen to the views of Kentucky's junior senator, Rand Paul, about Henry Clay.
Henry Clay's life is at best a mixed message. His compromises were over slavery. One could argue that he rose above sectional strife to keep the Union together, to preserve the Union. But one could also argue that he was morally wrong, and that his decisions on slavery, to extend slavery, were decisions that actually may have even ultimately invited the war that came. That his compromises meant that during the 50 years of his legislative career, he not only accepted slavery, but he accepted the slave trade. In the name of compromise, Henry Clay was by most accounts not a cruel master, but he was a master nonetheless of 48 slaves, most of which he did not free during his lifetime, and some of which he only freed belatedly 28 years after his death. He supported the fugitive slave law throughout his career. He compromised on the extension of slavery. When he was the Speaker of the House, there was a vote on extending slavery into Arkansas, and the vote was 88-88. He came down extraordinarily from the Speaker's chair to vote in favor of extending slavery into Arkansas. Before we eulogize Henry Clay, we should acknowledge and appreciate the contrast with contemporaries who refused to compromise. William Lloyd Garrison toiled at a small abolitionist press for 30 years, refusing to compromise with Clay's desire to send the slaves back to Africa. Garrison was beaten, chased by mobs, and imprisoned for his principled stand. Frederick Douglass traveled the country at the time. He was a free black man, but he traveled at great personal risk throughout the countryside, and he proved ultimately that he was the living, breathing example that intellect and leadership could come from a recently freed slave.
And we are back, and we are with another guest that I'd like to introduce. Alistine Turley is a history professor at the University of Louisville, and welcome to our discussion of Henry Clay. And before we get into the area of which you have spent a lot of your scholarship, which is slavery in that time period of Henry Clay, talk to me in the general sense about your impressions of Henry Clay and his legacy. What are your views of this man?
I think the image of him as a rock star and popular candidate, political figure, is very impressive. He is a lightning rod. He seems to be able to get people fired up either for or against him. He has the ability to inspire, and even on the abolitionist issues, he takes more heat than senators who are actually more, John C. Calhoun, for instance. Clay is probably a lot more talked about, written about, focused upon than some of the more prominent political figures.
We've spent time talking about his basics and haven't really delved into his position about slavery. Explain to us what his philosophical and political positions were about slavery.
Philosophically, he was against the idea of slavery. I guess for his time period, he would have been considered extremely liberal, and for a long time he was touted as an abolitionist, an emancipationist. He did not believe in slavery, but he also didn't think African Americans could survive in America as citizens. So the whole idea of the American Colonization Society, freedom outside the United States, sort of became his platform that he really stuck to throughout his presidency. Although he never, I'm making him president, throughout his political career, he never did deny the fact that he felt African Americans should have their freedom. He just was not willing to risk. He knew the political damage anti-slavery could do to his political career and to the country.
Jim Clotter, he was a slaveholder, correct?
He was a slaveholder and an anti-slavery man, and that caused him great grief all his life, because in the North he'd be criticized as a slaveholder, in the South he'd be criticized for his anti-slavery views.
Right.
And had he taken one side or the other, he might have been much better off as a politician, as Abraham Lincoln in the North, got elected president with all the Northern votes but no Southern votes.
Right.
And had Clay done that, had he freed his slaves, it may have helped him as a politician.
And the fact that he wasn't willing to do it, and the fact that he was stuck to his emancipation ideas despite the criticism. So that says a lot.
What do we know about the number of slaves he held here at Ashland and how he treated them?
He is recorded at the height of having 35. I think when he dies, he still is holding slaves. He emancipates some, those that he, most famous case, of course, is Charlotte, who is his servant in Washington, who doesn't want to return to Kentucky when he wants to come back, and who stays. And he literally, she takes him to court and loses. He also gets credit for freeing Charles and some of the other slaves here on the estate. But in the long run, he's a slave trader. He buys slaves too. I mean, he spends time at the market here in Lexington purchasing slaves, and is known for the quality of slaves that he purchases. So again, he's one of those people that's dual nature.
Yeah, it's one of those things that people used to talk about slavery in Kentucky being the mildest, but it didn't really matter. It was still slavery.
Right.
And an abolitionist came to Kentucky and said, people say slavery here is the mildest, but still there's enough here to cause the very heart to sicken. And that's what really slavery was. Right. Somebody said they heard the lash on the back and heard the screams of the slave, and that was a death knell of liberty. And that was a part of Clay that he could never quite see or pick up on as much as the other parts of his life.
I want to spend a minute more on this American Colonization Society. I read that at its first meeting, some pretty famous American names around the table, including Andrew Jackson, his nemesis, Daniel Webster, James Monroe, Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. How popular was the American colonization movement in this country?
Well, it was extremely popular, and of course Clay is considered one of the major, if not the founder. He gets federal funding for it to buy the land in Liberia for the resettlement. He promotes the idea of resettling African Americans in Haiti and Canada. He is known for this. This is what he becomes the lightning rod in the free black community in the North, because this is what causes them to unite against Henry Clay, in the sense that why should we have to leave the United States? It's popular in the white community, not popular in the South.
Now, Liberia was a death trap.
Yes.
And the people in America that had been slaves or were slaves, their forefathers had been here longer than a lot of the white people, the owners.
Exactly.
So they were more American in a sense. Why would we go back? Why should we leave our home?
Right. There are no connections to Africa whatsoever. And the fact that Clay was trying to remove primarily free blacks. The Colonization Society represented removal of free blacks from the country, not slaves. That was another controversial part.
I'm going to introduce a third person to our discussion. Ashland is open for tours and interprets the life of Henry Clay. And we have a special guest, Avery Malone, who is with us tonight. She is the Director of Tour Operations here. And Avery, before you take our viewers on a tour of the first part, let's get a little bit of sense of place. Ashland today is in what part of Lexington?
We are within the ring called New Circle Road. We're about 1.5 miles from downtown and about 1.5 miles from New Circle Road. So we're on the southeast edge of town in a beautiful residential area of Lexington.
And how many acres does the house have today, and how many did Henry Clay have at his zenith?
Today we sit on about 17 acres here at Ashland, and we have the contract for the first 125 acres that Henry Clay purchased, but at its height the farm was about 670 acres.
And we should learn a little bit more about his family before we go on tour here as well. He and his wife had how many children altogether, and did they all live here?
They had 11 children. However, they did not all live here at the same time. There was a lot of tragedy in the family. All 6 of Henry and Lucretia's daughters would die. Only 2 made it into early adulthood. and one of the sons died as well during Henry and Lucretia's lifetime. So there was a fair bit of tragedy here.
Now, the House interprets Henry Clay at what period in his life?
The House would interpret Henry Clay throughout his lifetime. We mentioned when he was born and show a picture of his birthplace, and go until his death in 1852. So we talk about the span of his life, we talk about his family and his political career, as well as his farming and legal career.
Well, what we're going to see now is what visitors to Ashland would see as they tour the first floor of the estate. So take us on a bit of a tour, if you would.
Well, we're in the foyer right now, and this is where the Clay family would have welcomed their guests. And the Clay family established a long legacy of welcoming guests here at Ashland. We have next the drawing room, where the family entertained their guests. And this is where we're filming tonight. Many of the Clay's important guests would have come to this room. It was the most formal room in the house. And we also have the dining room, where you can see Lucretia's ice cream service set on the table. The orange and white china service was given to her by her sister, and it was a gift purchased in France. And Lucretia was particularly known for her strawberry ice cream. I'd like to take you next into the study. And in the original house, this room was used by Henry Clay like a home office for his 3 careers. Henry, of course, was a farmer, a lawyer, and a statesman. I would like to draw attention to Henry Clay's portfolio and document box. Currently, we have the portfolio on loan to us from the Supreme Court, and Henry Clay would have used these items when he went to Washington, D.C. We also have a pair of stirrups that say H. Clay, and as a farmer, Henry Clay believed in breeding the best to the best, and because of this philosophy, 11 Kentucky Derby winners can draw their bloodlines back here to Ashland. Next, we have the library. Henry Clay began his legal career in 1797. We have his law license up here on the wall, and this was issued to him in 1797 in Virginia. Henry Clay would turn to his legal career throughout his life as a source of revenue or income, and his legal career and his great oratory really helped define who he was.
Well, we will be back with you throughout the program. You're going to be available to answer some of our viewer questions, and you'll also take us on a tour of other places in the house, Avery Malone. So thank you very much for this view of Ashland in Henry Clay's period. Who are some of the famous people he may have hosted here?
Several presidents came here. William Henry Harrison met with Clay here. Martin Van Buren came here 2 years before they thought they were going to be running against each other in 1844, and it's a real, stayed 4 or 5 days. It's a question, really, did they talk about trying to make the Texas issue go away? Because they both issued letters later on that said they opposed the annexation of Texas, which became a fierce issue in that campaign. Did they meet in rooms like this and talk over that? We don't know. Basically, a lot of famous people, including Lafayette and others, have been through this area, and all those people wanted to see Henry Clay. All the foreign visitors who came to America and went beyond the mountains wanted to come to Lexington, the Athens of the West, the cultural center of the West, because it was also the political center of the West with Henry Clay here.
We're going to mix in our first viewer phone call. It is from Brian in Springfield, Illinois. Brian, welcome to our conversation about Henry Clay.
Good evening. I want to thank C-SPAN for this series. It's a great idea. I'm calling from Springfield, Illinois with a non-Lincoln themed question. I wanted to ask the panel about 1824 and the corrupt bargain charge against Henry Clay when he backed John Quincy Adams over Jackson and accepted the Secretary of State position. Do you think that's the reason why we're referring to Henry Clay as contender instead of president?
The 1824 election.
That was used against Henry Clay the rest of his life, and it was one of his major political mistakes. There were 4 people in that race. The Constitution says the top 3 vote getters, if there's not a majority, will go to the House of Representatives, where each state will have 1 vote. Henry Clay ended up number 4 on that list. He probably should have been on the list, because if he'd gotten in as the Speaker of the House at the time, he would have been able to use his vast popularity to probably win the presidency by one-on-one campaigning in the House of Representatives, but he didn't. So he became the president maker, not the president. And before he even left Kentucky, before he left Ashland, he had said that he favored John Quincy Adams for the presidency. Adams had the same viewpoints. At that time, Jackson he called a mere general, and Clay always feared the Napoleons of the world. He feared that America would elect these generals and they would use some pretext to take over and become a dictator like Napoleon had during his lifetime. And so Clay really went to Washington knowing he was going to support Adams. His mistake was not supporting Adams, and in fact, that may have been his best compromise, was getting enough states to vote for Adams to be president, because Adams didn't carry but 9 states and 13 were needed. Clay did that. Adams was elected. But then Clay made his big mistake. He accepted the offer of the Secretary of State position from John Quincy Adams. That was a stepping stone to the presidency. Half of his people said he should do it, half of his advisors said he shouldn't, but he couldn't turn it down, and that was then used against him as a corrupt bargain.
Andrew Jackson was his great nemesis. What was Jackson's position on slavery?
Much more hostile than probably one of the first presidents. He marched into Florida mainly to clear out what he considered a threat from Florida. One of his major campaigns into Florida was the issue of free blacks with British support living in Florida, along with Native Americans who were raiding into American territories, taking slaves out of the United States. So he's very hostile toward any idea of freedom, and much more so than our presidents.
Next telephone call is from Scott, who's watching us in Boston. Hello, Scott.
Hi, how are you?
Great, thanks. You have a Henry Clay question for us?
I do. I went to high school in Eastport, Maine, which is on Moose Island, kind of a cool, foggy, a little bit dreary island there, very close to Canada. We all knew in Eastport that Henry Clay had insisted, after the War of 1812, the island had been taken by the British. He had insisted, when he negotiated the end of the Treaty of Ghent, that the island be returned to the United States, even when John Quincy Adams, who was another negotiator, was willing to sort of let Canada have the island, let British have the island. And I'm wondering if any of the historians would know why he was so adamant on the return of Moose Island and Eastport to America.
I don't know if you know the specifics of
Scott, I'm not an expert on Moose Island and why Clay. I do know that Clay, when making the treaty in the War of 1812, he took the strongest position of all the American delegates. He wanted America to have a strong position. Adams was afraid they would never even get a treaty if they took such positions, so Clay tended to try to get everything he could. And I'm not sure on Moose Island, though. I hope there's another historian out there that could tell us.
Alistine Turley, we talked before we got started live about Clay's antagonism towards the British.
Yes.
What can you tell us about that as a general point in his philosophy?
Well, he felt, of course, that the British were still trying to hold on, punish America with the War of 1812. He definitely wanted a war with England. He felt America, despite the fact we had a very small army, small navy, could still beat England. So I don't know if that was a source of pride or ego or what that was with Clay. But I often wondered if it had something to do with the British asking African Americans to fight against Americans during the War of 1812. If that could have been a part of it.
There was also, when he was a young man, and apparently his father's grave had just been dug, supposedly some British soldiers came into the household and they were trying to raid the household, and they actually thrust their swords into the freshly dug grave, thinking there might be goods that were hidden there. So he had an antipathy toward the British very early. He said that Kentucky militia alone can capture Canada when the War of 1812 started. He was wrong, as he was on other things. But when he got to Britain after the peace treaty had been signed, he stayed over there several months and met all the British important people, and he came back with a much little different view of the British. He still feared them and thought they would try to bully America, but he now became known as Prince Hal because he was associated with royalty so much that he maybe had gotten a little that felt off on him.
Let's talk for a minute, please, about the 1832 election. We were talking about Andrew Jackson, about 1832 when he faced off against him for the presidency.
In 1832, it was probably one of those elections that Clay couldn't win. Jackson was popular still. The things that make historians upset with Andrew Jackson, like his Indian policy, his policy toward African Americans and groups like that, those were positives for Andrew Jackson in his era, and in the South particularly. And in 1832, Clay also faced the fact there was a third party out there that would end up taking a sizable percentage of the vote, probably mostly from the Whig Party, or the party that would become the Whigs. And that was a party known as the Anti-Masonic Party. The whole issue of Masonry, which we still hear today with movies and things like that about it, the Anti-Masonic Party thought that the Masons should be done away with.
Clay was a Mason?
Clay was a Mason, and Andrew Jackson was a Mason. Clay was not a practicing Mason at the time, so it was kind of the lesser of two evils. But this third party took votes away from him, so he probably would have had a hard time winning anyway. Jackson was popular. And then the bank issue came up, where Clay favored the recharter of the National Bank of America. Jackson's vetoed it. And Clay thought it was going to be a very popular issue, that people would go to him and say, this is the right thing to do. But he didn't realize that Jackson's veto message was a great political message, because it made Andrew Jackson speak for the people and against this corporate monopoly, this bank. And Clay couldn't win on that issue. And so Clay lost on several levels there.
How close was the election?
Clay got 49 electoral votes. I think Jackson got 219.
C-SPAN has a website set up for this series, and we have lots more details. We have other video that you won't be seeing during our live production. And we also have details about their losing presidential elections and the outcomes. It's cspan.org/the Contenders if you're wanting to learn more history along the way with us here. Let's return to Avery Malone, the tour operations director at Ashland, now on the second floor. Avery, what do you have for us?
Well, we're in the Henry Clay bedroom right now, and you can see the bed behind me. This is Henry Clay's 1830s bed, and we even have a letter where he talks about how comfortable this bed was and that it didn't even have bed bugs. Upstairs we also have Henry Clay's dueling pistols. These were purchased in 1799 and later altered a bit. We believe that these went to war with his son in Mexico. Henry was in two duels, one with Humphrey Marshall and one with John Randolph. And the duel with John Randolph actually takes us back to Henry Clay as Speaker of the House. When Henry was chosen as Speaker of the House, he was chosen partly because they thought, here's a man who can meet John Randolph on the floor or on the field. And it happened that they met on the field. John Randolph compared Henry Clay to a character in the novel Tom Jones and basically called him a card cheat on the Senate floor. Henry wasn't there to defend himself and felt that no man should have to endure such a dishonor, so he challenged John Randolph to a duel. Now, unfortunately for Henry Clay, Randolph was really a great shot with pistols and Clay was not. But Randolph decided that he didn't want to deprive Lucretia or the nation of Henry Clay and decided to shoot at the ground. Fortunately, nobody was seriously injured in either of Henry Clay's duels.
How long did dueling, was it part of American political life?
Yeah, there was duels in Kentucky in the 1860s.
1860s?
Yeah, last ones.
Yeah, and Henry Clay knew he wasn't a great shot, so why did he get involved in this?
It was honor, the whole issue. Clay had a real sense of honor, and if your honor was attacked, then you had to defend it. Sometimes he would defend it through newspaper stories and letters. He wrote too many of those. But sometimes it got so bad, he thought the only way to defend it was to challenge someone. And if they answered the challenge, then he twice went to the dueling grounds, and that would be used against him as well. Randolph was particularly...
And this is Senator John Randolph of Roanoke, right?
Yes, Randolph of Roanoke, a man who was very eccentric. Had one of the great quotes, though, about Henry Clay. It may have been applied to other people, too, but he said that Henry Clay is like a rotten mackerel in the moonlight. He both shines and stinks. And that's a great vision there, that Clay both shines and stinks. And Randolph, disliked Clay for a lot of the things he did, but he admired Clay because Clay had the ability to do things. And even in the last part of his life, Randolph, as a dying man, wanted to come to the floor of the Senate, so he said he could listen to this magnificent voice one more time.
Our next telephone call is from David, San Francisco. David, welcome.
Thank you. I have one quick comment. That is that anybody who thinks that today's politics is overly divided should really take a look at the political verbiage in the Jacksonian era. But then the question is this, to particularly Dr. Clotter, is that do you find it a bit ironic that the Republican Party, which was formed out of the Whig Party, has evolved from a party founded by Henry Clay on the basis of public works and federal investment in local projects into one that opposes all that, and particularly with Mitch McConnell's comments? Thank you.
Yes. Hi, David. Basically, the Whig Party evolved and into the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln himself had been a Whig and became a Republican, and it had many of the aspects of the Whig Party. But in modern days, parties really have aspects of both of those. The Democratic Party has a lot of the central factions of the Whig Party. Some of the Republican business-oriented sections come from the Whig philosophy. So, in a sense, Henry Clay lives on in both parties, and maybe doesn't live on enough in both parties, but he still lives on in both parties.
Comments on that question?
Well, and certainly you mentioned 1830s. You have the rise of the anti-slavery, New England Anti-Slavery Society, who becomes a thorn. And he does develop some democratic ideals. He definitely is against the idea of a gag rule in Congress, which many of the Southerners and Northerners want. And for the sake of freedom, he definitely overrules that idea. He wants these petitions, even though he doesn't support it. He wants it heard.
Before we get too far into the 1830s, we really haven't spent time on one of the first of the three great compromises that he's known for, and that's the Missouri Compromise. Will you talk a little bit about the politics around that?
Missouri wanted to come into the Union and
what time frame are we talking
1820. Missouri wants to come into the Union. Question is, will it be a slave state or not? Maine is about to enter at the same time, so it ends up that the two come in, one is slave, one is free, but that wasn't necessarily going to be decided at the beginning. And the whole question of slavery, it's like a fire bell in the night, as Thomas Jefferson said. When the slavery question arises, it's always been there, it's kind of smoldering like a fire, and now the Missouri Compromise feeds that fire and brings it to the forefront, and there's debates and debates. Where will slavery, will it continue? Will it go on? Will it be everywhere in the nation? Will it be somewhere in the nation? Will it be limited? And there's attempts to limit it completely. Clay is not really the man who makes the first compromise, the first Missouri Compromise. It's a lot of the ideas were here, but it came from other people. And he works to get it through, but it's not really his compromise. But then once it's through and everything seems like it's done, Missouri passes a law, and part of their Constitution says that free blacks will not be able to go in Missouri. And the United States Constitution says American citizens can go anywhere. And so this is the compromise that Clay, because everything else is getting ready to fall apart. And Clay works out a very convoluted answer to that satisfies everybody and satisfies nobody. But at the same time, it ends the crisis. And he hopes then that slavery will not be an issue, because to Clay, slavery is the real thorn in his side. He can never come up with a solution on that. And if it's a wound, it's a self-inflicted wound, because Clay was a slaveholder.
Right. And that makes it difficult for him to please. He starts out people believing that he's an emancipationist and he's on the North side. And then over time, he's hated by both the North and South. It's a no-win situation for him.
We are halfway through our 90-minute discussion on the life and times of the contender, Henry Clay, who ran for the White House throughout most of his political career, 5 times in total, 3 times as his party's nominee, and unsuccessful all the while, but with a great effect on the direction and future of his country. We're going to take a very short break and then be back at Ashland, his home in Lexington, Kentucky, to talk more. And welcome back to Ashland, the home of Henry Clay in Lexington, Kentucky, a place that has been preserved and is open for tours. The people who spend their professional lives helping to curate this place hope that you will be inspired to come down and visit them after our 90-minute discussion tonight about Henry Clay. Let me reintroduce you to our guest. Alistine Turley is a professor of history here in the state of Kentucky, Georgetown. Tell us about your college, will you please?
Yes, I'm a professor at the Department of Pan-African Studies, University of Louisville, one of 13 Pan-African Studies departments in the country.
And you were colleagues at Georgetown?
We were colleagues at Georgetown College, and that's where I teach American history now.
And where is Georgetown, Kentucky?
It's about 12 miles north of Lexington in the next county, so they're very close.
And when you were colleagues, did you debate a lot?
We did. We did. But it's hard to debate someone like Jim Clotter. I mean, he definitely is a scholar on Kentucky history. I just try to keep up.
And 25 years as Kentucky's state historian. What does the job entail?
State historian of Kentucky is basically a self-defined job, but to me it involves writing the history of the state, and I've tried to do that. It involves working with people who are writing about Kentucky's history and helping them, aiding them, offering advice, suggestions, trying to stay out of their way sometimes. And it also entails going around and giving talks and appearing in things like this in public to tell the story of the state and the people who lived in here.
And Avery Malone is with us. She is the Director of Tour Operations here at Ashland. Avery, would you tell us about how many people come to this place every year, how it's financed, and how it's operated?
Well, it varies by season how many people you'll find visiting Ashland. Certainly the tourists come when the leaves change and Keeneland is in full swing, and at Christmas and throughout the summer. We have somewhere around 15,000 a year come to see us. We are financed through a variety of methods and means, and we're very fortunate to have all of our visitors and all of the friends of Ashland's who donate to keep us open and for us to tell the public about Henry Clay and Compromise.
What year did the place open for tours originally?
We opened in 1950 for tours, and this was only 2 years after Nanette Bullock died. She was Henry Clay's great-granddaughter, and she was the one who really preserved Ashland by starting the Henry Clay Memorial Foundation. So just 2 years after she passed away, and her son lived here until 1959, so we were only open downstairs, and then after he moved out, we opened throughout the house.
All three of our guests available for your questions. Let's take another one. This is from Shelby, watching us in Sacramento, California.
Yes, hello. I'm also a great-grandson of a Mr. Lauer who had helped with the anti-slavery movement. Before I get to my main question, I would like to say that he had a hardware store, and when slaves would come into town and they needed to be housed, his secret and magical phrase to his neighbors were, "We have some two-penny nails in." And my grandmother, Myrtle Lauer Janes, knew that there was some kind of magical significance to that. And so when she had a horse, was given a horse as a young lady, she named the horse Two Penny Nails. And so perhaps we can remember all of those slaves that were able to find freedom, and what a great country this is, and what a terrific thing to have C-SPAN. I'm grateful to participate in this series, especially
Great,
with
and we appreciate it. And we do need your question because we have a lot of callers in line.
Well, yes. I saw masonry emblems on the buildings in the beautiful city of Louisville, Kentucky. And my question was, could you tell us, please, what association Henry Clay may have had with that city? Thank you.
Okay. With the city of Louisville.
Well, Clay's son, Henry Clay Jr., lived in Louisville and in Lexington. And Clay Jr. Used some of his wife's money again to basically buy a lot of property when Louisville was on the rise, and so he became quite wealthy as a young man. That son ended up being killed in the Mexican War, killed by Mexican lances. But Clay would visit there and help his son, and it was a rival of Lexington, though, because Louisville eclipsed Lexington in population in 1830 for the first time. The river boats there made Louisville on the artery of communication and transportation. And Lexington was kind of in a backwater now because it's not on a water system. And so his connection with Louisville was a mixed one, but it generally supported the Whig side.
Next phone call is from Willie, and Willie is in Columbus, Ohio. Willie, you're on.
Thank you. I'd like to know real quickly, any connection, any association. I've always been under the impression former heavyweight champion Cassius Clay always said that was his slave name. Any association at all? Thank you.
Alistine Turley.
Well, certainly the name Cassius Marcellus Clay it stands out for Americans because he was considered an abolitionist and anti-slavery advocate here in Lexington, ran an anti-slavery newspaper. However, it's my understanding, and maybe Jim knows better than I, but I don't think there was a real family connection with Cassius Marcellus Clay.
Yeah, John Edgerton did a story for the New Yorker once, and I did some research helping him on that. And the man known as Muhammad Ali, who was originally Cassius Marcellus Clay, was named for the abolitionist leader, but his family that he came from was from Western Kentucky. They just took that name because the distant cousin of Henry Clay. Cassius Clay was an abolitionist or anti-slavery man, certainly, and they thought that was a good name to take when they had freedom.
The election of 1840, Henry Clay tries once again for his Whigs Party nomination. He was defeated in that quest by whom?
William Henry Harrison.
And then Harrison turned around and offered Clay the vice presidential spot. Is that right?
I'm not sure he offered Clay the vice presidency. He offered him his choice of cabinet positions.
Because I was thinking here was his chance to get that close because of the way fate played with the Harrison presidency.
Yeah, that would have been the ironic aspect of everything on that. But
why did he offer him his choice of cabinet position?
Well, they'd been rivals, and again, here's another general, a man who said he hadn't voted for 30 years when he was seeking the presidency. He had some positions in Indiana Territory and some other places, had some history of accomplishments, but not a great deal. And Clay is expecting to get the presidency. It's a time when the Whigs think they're going to win, because America's in a depression. The Whig policies look like they're the things that you need to get you out of the depression. Whoever they put out there is going to have a very good shot at beating the incumbent Martin Van Buren. Clay wants it. This is one of those examples where Henry Clay is not a good politician. He's good in Congress, but he's not a good manager. He's not a good campaign. He doesn't have a campaign manager. He trusts his own instincts too much rather than trust the advice of other people. And he's basically outmaneuvered by people like Thurlow Weed from New York, who's backing Harrison. And they get a rule changed in the convention itself so that Clay, who has a majority of the votes, they now, instead of saying you're just going to vote by number, you're going to vote by state delegation. So however the state goes, the whole state vote goes to that person. That negated Clay's advantage. He loses out to Harrison. But Harrison realized that Clay was very important in the Whig Party, obviously. So he wants to make peace. He doesn't want Clay on the opposite side. So that's why he offers Clay these positions. But Clay basically says he'd rather stay where he is. He thinks he has more important things to do there. And he doesn't really want to be associated with the Harrison presidency, really.
Our next caller is Bill here in Lexington, Kentucky. Hi, Bill.
Hi, calling from Lexington. I'm actually a teacher at Henry Clay High School, which is right up the street from where y'all are sitting right now. I'd like to ask whether the panelists think that Henry Clay's reputation as a compromiser hurt his chances of being president, and whether or not his losses as president, a three-time loser, actually made it possible for him to have a greater impact and a more positive one on the country through his long legislative career.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to ask all three of our guests very briefly to answer that question. Let's start with you, Alistine Turley.
Well, I think being a compromiser, yes, by 1840, it definitely does hurt him. He is unwilling to change his position on Texas, so that upsets the Southerners. His stand on anti-slavery upsets New England and the Northerners. He is trying to straddle the fence, and I think it does hurt him more than help him.
Avery Malone, the question, did his years as a compromiser ultimately hurt him in his quest for the presidency? What do you tell people here?
Well, I'm unsure, but I do know that being a compromiser is not universally popular during the present time when someone's seeking a position of power. People usually want you to take a strong stance.
And your thoughts on this?
Well, Emerson said that a foolish consistency is a hobgoblin of small minds. Clay was not consistent all of his life. He at one time opposed a bank in the United States when he was a young man, then he favored one later on. He changed a little on different positions over time. He gave up on the tariff in the 1833 compromise. So his enemies used that against him and said he wasn't consistent, that he would compromise and trim his sails to anything as long as they were getting votes. I don't think that was the case. I think, but he was willing to take a change and make a change and say that he had been wrong. And that's hard for a politician to do, and it sometimes costs you, and it cost him.
We had an earlier caller that wanted to reference the Treaty of Ghent, and we talked about Henry Clay's views about the British. We're going to see what's called the Ghent Code in just a minute, but what was the Treaty of Ghent's significance?
Basically, it ends the War of 1812, which the Americans are not winning at the time the delegates get over there. And it gets worse because they thought that the British would be still fighting Napoleon, and Napoleon is out of the way by the time the deliberations start. So the Americans are not negotiating from a place of strength. But in a sense, they get about the best treaty they can. They do as well as they can. And it's one of our best delegations ever. You have John Quincy Adams, you have Henry Clay, you have three other people of importance there. and it draws out. It takes a long time to come about, but given the fact that they didn't have a lot to work with, they came up with a very strong treaty for America, and it was hailed that way too. And it didn't hurt that Andrew Jackson then won the Battle of New Orleans after the treaty had been signed, but the news had not reached America. So it was almost like the two things came at the same time, so it looked like we won the war, even though the treaty had been signed before the battle had been fought.
Avery, you have the Ghent jacket. Can you tell us about it and its significance?
Yes, we have the Ghent jacket here, and this is the diplomatic issue jacket that Henry Clay would have been given to go to Ghent and to negotiate peace. This jacket's very significant in that it's one of the few pieces in the collection that we have that belong to Henry Clay. This jacket also served as an artifact during the time that the Kentucky A&M was here, a forerunner to UK. They used this jacket as an artifact then as well.
We're going to go back to telephone calls. Next is from Denver. Michael.
Good evening. My family and I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and in the 50s we all went to Henry Clay Elementary School for 7 years. So he's always been a source of fascination for me. I used to come to Louisville and Lexington on business, and I'm sorry I didn't realize you guys were there. I have a very simple question. This very best-selling biography on him called Henry Clay, The Essential American by David Heidler is very popular, and I'm wondering if you've read it, and would it be a good choice for me to learn about Henry Clay, or do you have something else to suggest? Thank you very much.
Well, we just happen to have Heidler's book here. It's one of the several books available in the bookstore, and they have a number of biographies. But I'm going to ask both of you, if you're just starting out, what would be the book you'd pick up about Henry Clay?
That's the most recent biography, and it has a lot of strength on the human side of Henry Clay. Gene Heidler is the co-author of that as well. And it's the newest biography. If you want political emphasis, probably Robert Remini's book, which is about 20 years old, on Henry Clay is about the same size. But if you want to start out on something smaller, there's Daniel Walker Howe did a book many years ago which has a chapter on Henry Clay about the American Whig Party. And that's a good introduction on Henry Clay, and he has a very good view. If you want to compare Clay and Calhoun and Webster, the Great Triumvirate, Merrill Peterson did a book back in the 70s called that, The Great Triumvirate, and it's a very good, balanced view on all three men and kind of gives you a nice comparison to start with. And of course, Lindsay Apple has just done a book on the family legacy of Henry Clay, and Apple's book is excellent, and it also takes Clay's family beyond just his lifetime into almost to the present.
Alistine Turley, what would you pick up either for him or the period?
For him, Remini and definitely the Triumphant are things triumphant that I've read, that because it does bring in Daniel Webster and some of the other important figures of the time. And for African Americans, it puts it in perspective as far as what's going on in the country and what the great debates are about. So definitely, I've not read the newer version. I'm waiting for Jim's book that's coming out. So that'll be the next one that I'll pick up to read.
When and what is the next book?
My working title is The Great Rejected, Henry Clay and the American Presidency.
How about that? Perfect timing.
The Great Rejected is a quote that was said about Clay at the end of his life, that he was the great rejected by the people, but that he stood out above them because of that. And I'm about to finish writing it this month, or early next month, and then I've got to go through the publication process. So about a year away, I hope.
I thought we could get it finished before the Contenders series was over this year. Well, the current Speaker of the House has many of his powers. I think that he can look back to the speakership of Henry Clay. He spoke about Henry Clay recently. Let's listen to Speaker John Boehner.
Henry Clay, the first what I'll call strong Speaker of the House, the real leader of the House. When our country was founded and the Congress was put together, the first speakers over the first 20 years or so came out of the English Parliament system, and they were more of a referee, didn't have any real power. But Clay was the first real Speaker of the House that had some power. And there's a lot of things you can say about roles of the Speaker. Henry Clay was clearly a very strong Speaker. And if you look at the period from 1820 to 1860, there was no one person in the United States more responsible for holding our union together than Henry Clay.
By the way, that was from an event that was organized by the folks here at Ashland, where they invited all living speakers to come and talk about the role of speakers. It was held at Transylvania University here, and it is on our video library if you'd like to go back and watch it. Quite an interesting event that they hosted here, bipartisan discussion about the role of speakers. To both of you, how did Henry Clay enhance the powers of the speaker?
The force of his personality. I think no one wanted to debate him. Certainly he had the force to win the argument. So I think that alone had great influence and power. I don't know if any other speaker would be comparative.
He also understood as the power of committee assignments.
The committees, I was going to say, the committees basically, he understood that the speaker had the power to put the people he wanted on the committees, and when it's something important, he was known to be a fair man as a speaker, and that was very important, that both sides of the aisle respected him and respected his opinions. He was never overridden as in his rulings, and he basically was fair in the makeup of the committees, but when he knew there was a certain issue coming up, you can see a slight inclination to put the friends to that issue, that he wanted the issue to go a certain way. So he understood very early that. He also changed, the rules changed with his backing. It gave the speaker more power, cut off debate, to limit debate, things like that, that allowed him to be a much more important, powerful figure than anybody before. But Alistair's absolutely correct. It was his force and his will that made it as important as anything else.
Next telephone call is from Raymond in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Hi, Raymond. Raymond, we're going to move on. Let's take a call from Lonnie, watching in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Lonnie, you're on the air.
Good evening. Lincoln once referred to Clay as his beau ideal of a statesman. I always believed that the two men had never met. However, recently I came across a web page which purported to show a book, I believe it said, that had been inscribed by Clay to Lincoln. Could the panel comment on this a bit? I mean, what is the thinking now? Did Clay and Lincoln ever meet?
Louisville, did he meet him in?
Well, we don't know, basically. There was one person who left a memoir about the turn of right between the 19th and 20th century that said that that person had seen the two in Lexington. Abraham Lincoln married Mary Todd Lincoln, Mary Todd, who was from Lexington, and her family was very closely allied with the Clays, so her family knew the Clays. Lincoln came to Kentucky several times in connection with the family and the states that followed it, and he certainly heard Henry Clay speak. Whether they met is unknown, but can't you imagine what a great time it would have been had they you have to think they tried to meet, if nothing else. But had Lincoln come to Ashland, and the two of them would sit here in a parlor, and Clay would say, something, and Mr. Lincoln would say, well, that reminds me of a story. And then Henry Clay would say, well, that reminds me of a story, and they would go back and forth. But Lincoln never said he met Clay, so I think that's very possibly that he would have said that had he known. He did say that Clay was his beau ideal of a statesman. He did say, when he went to 1860, when he was getting ready to write his inaugural, he took 4 things with him to write the inaugural with, and one of those 4 items was Henry Clay's speech in the Compromise of 1850. So Clay's effect on Abraham Lincoln was important. During the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln said that the views of Henry Clay are the views of Abraham Lincoln as well.
We're going to take a call, and then we must spend some time talking about the 1844 election. So let's listen to a question from Charles in Whittier, California.
Hello. My question is this. I'm a Kentuckian, born in Maysville, Kentucky, the home of Rosemary Clooney. And I understand from the panel, your 2 guests, is that Henry Clay is considered the favorite son of Kentucky. And although he and Lincoln were members of the Whig Party, I don't understand how he could be the favorite son and not Abraham Lincoln, who, when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, said to her, "You are that little lady that started this great war." And she is never mentioned, nor is Uncle Tom, who is, I consider, the greatest Christian in American literature. Neither are mentioned ever as being great in their time. And yet, on the times in which they lived, and even today, their influence is greatly felt, especially by many African Americans who are historically informed. Why is not Lincoln?
Celestine Turley, that caller's comments, you respond, please?
Well, Abraham Lincoln certainly, Kentucky, he may have started off as being a friend to Kentucky, but certainly when the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, he becomes a much hated figure here in Kentucky. So Henry Clay, who considered himself a Westerner, but many Southerners would choose him over Abraham Lincoln, who's certainly considered a traitor to the Kentucky cause. You mentioned Harriet Beecher Stowe, who is a popular Kentucky figure. We read and study her, but Lincoln and that relationship, he's much more popular in the North and New England than he ever becomes in the South, particularly at the end of the Civil War.
Lincoln in 1860, running on the Northern ticket, received only, I think, 5 votes in his wife's home county. Even his in-laws didn't vote for him. He received something like 1,000 votes in the entire state of Kentucky. To vote for Lincoln in 1860 for Kentuckians would have been like voting for a communist in the 1950s. He was a radical Republican, the Red Republican, and he just didn't have any support here. And Kentucky at the beginning of the war wanted Union and slavery, and when he decides that the war, by the middle of the war, is going to be a war against slavery finally, that turns many Kentuckians against the administration, and that state that had been Unionist at the beginning of the war becomes almost pro-Confederate by the end of the war. So Lincoln and his party are on the outs in Kentucky for a long period of time. It's only in the 20th century that Kentucky starts to reclaim Abraham Lincoln with the building of the memorial to his birthplace, and then a Lincoln Commission that was created just in the 21st century. So Kentucky has reclaimed Lincoln belatedly, but he was on the wrong side, basically, for most Kentuckians after the war.
How far from where we are physically is the Lincoln birthplace?
Oh, it's probably an hour and 15-minute drive straight down the interstate.
And in that time period, how long would it have taken to cross?
It took Henry Clay to go from Lexington to Frankfort, which is a distance about 25 miles all day, sometimes in the mud and the mire of those days, until that's why he was so much in favor of building better roads and canals through federal government aid.
By the way, Avery Malone, during this discussion of Lincoln, we had a brief picture of an artifact that you have here in the collection, which has an inscription to Abraham Lincoln. Can you tell us what we were looking at?
Yes, this book is actually called The Life and Speeches of Henry Clay, and there's an inscription in it that says, "To Abraham Lincoln, with constant regard to friendship, Ashland, H. Clay, 1847. And we believe that this book was given to Abraham Lincoln from Clay as sort of a gift to Lincoln in exchange for what we believe Lincoln would have given a condolence gift to Henry Clay after his son Henry Jr. was killed in the Mexican-American War.
But we don't know that those were delivered personally.
We don't. We don't know if they ever met. There's no documentation to say that they have. But we know that at least that Henry Clay did know Abraham Lincoln, that there must have been some type of a relationship based on this artifact.
We have a little less than 20 minutes left in our 90 minutes on Henry Clay, the first of our 14 contenders in our look at American history. Let's take our next telephone call. It's from Louisville. This is Rob watching us nearby. Hi, Rob.
No, actually, it's Robin.
Robin, I'm sorry. Hello, Robin. Welcome to the conversation.
I actually have 3 questions, and I'll try to go really fast and get out of your way and let your guest answer. Both of your guests mentioned Clay's contradictions. Professor Turley mentioned Clay's apparent connection to abolitionists early on. I'm curious to know whether he changed his mind, or was that merely political posturing in their opinions, or, a lie? Second question is, another caller mentioned the 2 Cassius Clays. But I'm curious as to whether it's known whether or not Henry Clay or any of his household members or immediate family members actually had any known slave descendants like Jefferson. Third question, politicians often have political or aristocratic lineage, and I'm curious to know if it's known if any other prominent politicians share Henry Clay's lineage. Now I'm out of your way. Thank you.
Hey, Robin, before you go, have you been here to the house? But we lost her. She lives so close by, I was wondering with her interest if she'd been here. All right, so abolitionist and whether or not his position changed or was posturing.
Well, I think it would be wrong to call Henry Clay an abolitionist. He was definitely not an abolitionist. He was for the idea of emancipation. And no, he never changed his position on that. And as we discussed earlier, especially in the election of 1840, that it hurts him. The fact that he tries to waffle and straddle the fence. But no, he never backs away from his idea of emancipation.
Cassius Clay.
I was going to say, Robin, in 1799, Clay speaks out the first time publicly in Kentucky against slavery in a letter to the local paper. And 50 years later, when he does the same thing again, when Kentucky's trying to adopt a new constitution and they're hoping to get slavery abolished in it, which doesn't happen, he takes basically the same stance. So over a 50-year period, he's pretty consistent. The thing is that over that 50 years, the world had changed around him. His views were still the same.
Her question about Cassius Clay's? Two Cassius Clays?
I know of no, with the question about whether or not they're African American, no, I'm not aware of that.
So whether or not he had any descendants who were African Americans?
There were at least one story that appeared something like 40 years after Henry Clay's death, that a woman said that she had been a mistress of Henry Clay, but I have found nothing to substantiate that story. And there were also several Henry Clays in this area, so it may have been she was mixed up with somebody else. There's a list, I mean, you can pretty much have compiled a list of the Clay slaves, and I didn't see her name there anywhere, so I don't think that happened. Cassius Clay, probably not either as far as I know. He had an illegitimate offspring, but it was in Russia when he was ambassador to Russia. That offspring showed up at his door one day at Whitehall, the Cassius Clay home here in Kentucky, and the shock of that caused his wife to eventually divorce Cassius Clay.
Now, the last question I just wrote down, aristocratic lineage. Do you remember her exact question?
If anybody, I think she said, was if anybody, politicians have the same connection, have any connection to Clay as far as being related to Clay. I'm not sure that I know of anybody else.
So there was no family dynasty in politics?
I don't think so.
All right, let me move on because we're going to run out of time here. The 1844 election against James Polk. This time Clay was successful in securing the Whig nomination. Everything I've read about it said it was one of the dirtiest campaigns conducted. What were the issues, or was it real personal politics? Or both?
Well, Clay goes in as a favorite on this for a change. And James K. Polk is the first dark horse candidate for the presidency. He went in hoping to be vice president, ends up being the presidential nominee of the Democrats. So the Democrats are scrambling from behind. Clay had been organizing a campaign for 2 years. There's campaign biographies everywhere. There's sheet music with Clay's pictures and names. There's all kinds of ribbons and buttons and medals that you can do. So the Democrats basically, coming from behind, have to attack. And they attack Clay pretty heavily on all those issues. The 1844 election is a perfect storm of bad things happening to Henry Clay. He writes too many letters and says too many things, causing him to look like he's waffling on the issue of Texas annexation, which was a big issue at the time. All these issues of drinking, gambling, and carousing comes back against him and is used against Clay. And I think it's more the combination of things that defeat Clay. The standard view is that the Texas annexation issue, Polk takes that and says we need to annex Texas. The northern abolitionists and others in the north oppose that because they think it will bring war with Mexico, which it does. Clay opposes annexation unless it takes place on a peaceful basis. So he's going against kind of America's manifest destiny. He's going against the national mood. And I don't think that defeats him, though, because he wins some votes because of his stand on that as well as loses some votes. It's more there's a whole slew of issues, and then there's the issues of fraud and bad luck and things like that, which plague Clay in every election he goes through as well.
And you hear a lot about this being an example of the early example of the politics of personal destruction. Was this on both sides? Was Henry Clay a practitioner of those kinds of politics?
I think he was his own worst enemy. He certainly trusted the wrong people, I think, in the 1844 campaign. He doesn't listen to advisors. This is still a problem for him in 1844. He believes his own press that he is the favorite, and he doesn't see the challengers as serious, so he's not really campaigning. Yeah, he shoots himself in the foot a couple times.
Now, he opposed Texas annexation, predicting it would lead to war with Mexico. He was correct. The great irony, his son goes to fight in that war, and what happened to his son?
His son is killed in the war. His son had lost a wife a few years before, and it was almost was very depressed for a period of time, and it's almost like he was trying to go off to fight, to forget as much as anything else. And he's wounded, and he tells his men to leave him and to retreat, and they do, and he's killed. Clay, some parts of that are sent back to Clay from the killing of his son. It hits him very hard, and Clay makes this anti-war speech. He basically says, I support the troops, but I oppose the war. And it's a speech that many people consider a very courageous speech at the time, because it was going against a lot of the national mood in the South, particularly, which was one of his constituents areas. So.
And let's take another call. This is Molly, Bridgeton, New Jersey. Hi, Molly.
Hello. I was wondering if your panelists could talk a little bit about the relationship between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay.
Thank you.
Well, Molly, Clay and Adams were a very mismatched couple. Adams is the New England Puritan background. If you read his diary, he's critical of everybody, including himself. I think he could only be happy in some ways talking to himself, and even then not happy. He's critical. He's a man of great talent. He speaks many foreign languages. He's well versed for the presidency, the son of a president. And there's a great passage in one of his diaries where, when they're at Ghent, that Adams is getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and Henry Clay is coming in from a night of card playing. And Adams looks at this with great frowns with this and says, this is the debauchery of Henry Clay. Of course, why is it wrong for him to be up at 4 a.m. in the morning, Clay coming in at late? You know, you could turn it around and say it's the other way around. But this is John Quincy Adams. Henry Clay, as we've talked about in this program, is a very different kind of person. And they constantly tweaked each other and talked to each other and didn't like each other in a lot of ways, but they respected each other. And when Clay makes John Quincy Adams President of the United States in 1825, everybody expected they would fight and they would break away from each other, but Clay is a very loyal Secretary of State, and Adams gains more respect for Clay, Clay gains more respect for Adams, and they may not have never been friends, but they were certainly greatly respectful of each other the rest of their lives.
Avery Malone, we're reaching back into the earlier part of Henry Clay's career. This is a good time to look at one of Ashland's most prized possessions. That's the Washington Goblet. Will you tell us about it?
Yes, we do have the Washington Goblet here. And this was the item of greatest patriotic inspiration in Henry Clay's home. You can see that it's chipped or broken, and this is how Henry Clay received it. And he wrote about how he had received this from an elderly lady as a gift, and that it had belonged to George Washington through most of the Revolutionary War. He used this like an artifact in his house, and really used it to connect us to our early nationhood and as an object to venerate George Washington. He felt Washington, as many throughout the country did, was a great inspiration to our country, and hoped to inspire patriotism in people who visited here at Ashland.
Ms. Malone, we're quickly running out of time here, and since we have you, let me ask you about Henry and Clay and his wife, and how often they lived here together. He had such a long political career requiring him to be in Washington so frequently. Did his family move to Washington with him, or did they remain behind most of the time?
His family did go with Henry Clay to Washington early on, but around the 1830s was really the last time that Lucretia would go with Henry Clay to Washington. Lucretia had plenty here on the farm to keep her busy. There were children and grandchildren here to occupy her time. Lucretia was never one to really enjoy the limelight. She was not heavily into fashion and attention, so she did enjoy the solace that Ashland provided here. In the later part of Henry Clay's life, the last half, I believe he was gone as much as he was home, and some have surmised that Henry Clay was addicted to travel, which is one thing we'd probably all like to do more of, but Henry was gone quite frequently to campaign. Henry was gone working in Washington and on trips, for instance, to see his daughter in New Orleans.
Next call is from Kentucky, town of Paducah. This is Gerald. Hi, Gerald.
Hi there. How are y'all doing? It's and really enjoying the program. Hey, my last name is Watkins, Gerald Watkins, and Henry Clay was my 7th cousin. His grandmother, Sarah Watkins, was a sister to my 5th great-grandfather, John Watkins. So I'm real proud of Henry Clay and that connection. But my question is, The 3 times he won the nomination, it seems like the timing was really not good for his candidacy. They seemed doomed. Do you believe there was a presidential election during his time of prominence that would have been better timing, that he could have won the presidency?
Yeah, I think he could have won in 1840 pretty reasonably, and in 1848, Zachary Taylor is going to be the Whig nominee, and Henry Clay opposed any general, and Clay particularly opposed Zachary Taylor because Taylor had done nothing other than be a general. He had nothing in his background, and he had never voted even before he ran for president. So Clay very reluctantly tries to get the nomination in 1848 and fails. But had Clay gotten that nomination, I think he would have won too. The Democrats were divided that year. Clay was quoted by someone as saying that, that the years he could get the nomination, he can't, and his friends, are basically deserting him because John J. Crittenden of Kentucky was one of the backers of Zachary Taylor, and Clay saw that as almost a betrayal of all the things that he had done.
Alstine Turley, since we've fast-forwarded to 1848, let's move ahead to 1850, Henry Clay's last big effort on public policy and the Compromise of 1850. What was that compromise all about? Set the stage for us about what was happening in this country.
1850, this decision about the expansion of how slave states, whether they come in as free or slaveholding, the idea of strengthening the fugitive slave law, of course, becomes one of the breaking points. The idea of California, if whether or not. So the decision ends up being California can make its own decision about whether or not slaves can be held in the state. Missouri comes in, New Mexico and Arizona, exactly. So again, we are now truly into the manifest destiny where United States reaches from coast to coast. And for African Americans, the strengthening of the fugitive slave law becomes a major issue in American politics leading up to the Civil War.
Jim, we only have about 4 minutes left, but on the Compromise of 1850, it's so important. Henry Clay was not successful. He was reaching the end of his strength and health. How did it all turn out?
I think it says something about Henry Clay. In 1849, he comes back to the Senate after his defeat in 1844. He'd been at home and living in this quiet and the peace and serenity of Ashland, and he has nothing to gain. He's not going to run for president anymore. But he comes out of retirement to hope, in essence, save the country in his mind one more time in 1850 with the Compromise. And in Missouri, he'd broken all the little pieces up and got them passed one by one. In 1850, he listens to somebody and they put it all together in an omnibus bill that says, let's pass this all at once. It doesn't pass. So Clay goes off to Rhode Island to take the waters, and the bill does pass piecemeal under Stephen Douglas. Clay thought and was roundly supported on this, that this would bring peace in his lifetime, and it did, because he dies 2 years later. But within a decade of that, the Civil War begins, partially over the fugitive slave law that was part of that compromise.
Henry Clay dies in 1852. He is buried where?
In Lexington, in the cemetery.
Right nearby. We have some video of his gravesite. His funeral was really quite an event, a 1,000-mile train cortege. Tell me more about it.
I mean, of course, his trusted servant, Charles, is still at his side to the very end with the funeral pyre. He's viewed, people come from all over, the trains are coming in, and thousands of people in Lexington for the funeral. So it's national news.
And I think the thing about that monument, there's monuments to Clay. I think he's got more images in the capital, the nation's capital, than any other individual. Atlantic magazine in 2006 put him as one of the 100 most influential Americans of all time. I think the best monument to Clay is not any of those things. I think it's the fact that Henry Clay kept a divided nation together. The nation is still one nation, united, still a working democracy, and it's still trying very hard to live up to the spirit of Henry Clay.
We have time for a very quick call from Bowling Green, Kentucky. You have a quick question for us?
Yes, my name is Dr. Ann Anya Colojay, and my question, why do you suppose Henry Clay was not interested in a woman's perspective on slavery? And the reason why I ask that question, European Victorian woman by the name of Harriet Martineau had traveled to America, to Kentucky, in 1834 or 1835, and she visited...
Caller, I'm going to interrupt you because we understand the history and we have very little time. So
Harriet Martineau, of course, is sent by Britain, so that's enough for Clay not to like her. But I would certainly say that just his Southern principles about women's place.
Yeah, he loved women. Had women been able to vote, Henry Clay would have been president many times because by all the estimates, women of America liked Henry Clay. Despite all these rumors about him and everything else, everybody uniformly says that women liked Henry Clay, would have voted for him. Martineau came to Ashland, stayed here. She didn't like the Clay children, but she liked Henry Clay when she got here, even though she had problems with Henry Clay. And so that was part of the nation and the America of his time too, the contradictions and the controversy around Henry Clay.
we heard Jim's views of why Henry Clay was important for our country. Would you close with yours?
He was important for the country because he polarized and made America make a decision on slavery. The 1850 Compromise, which did pass, African Americans fled to Canada. It increased the public awareness of slavery in America. So that was his major contribution, I think.
We just skimmed the surface of a 49-year political career for Henry Clay, our first of 14 Contenders men who didn't achieve their quest for the presidency but changed American history. I want to say thanks to our guests, Alistine and Jim here, and Avery, who is the tour director, for helping us better understand Henry Clay's life. Also have a couple other quick thank yous. The Henry Clay Memorial Foundation for both preserving Ashland and for sharing it with all of us around the country tonight. Deborah Korb, who is the executive director, Eric Brooks, who is the curator, outstanding help to our crew in putting this program together, and their colleagues, both volunteers and staff here at Ashland. And then a personal thank you to C-SPAN's former board chairman, Bob Myron, and his spouse Diane, who traveled all the way to Kentucky to be with us. History buffs that they are as we kick off the first of our Contenders series. Thanks for being with us as we learned more tonight about the life of Henry Clay.